Let's move on to the next question to you. And moving away from Europe now, India's relations with China took a sharp downturn.
The Chinese violated those agreements. Now, the state of the border will determine the state of the relationship. In this world, no country, not even the United States today, has the ability to address big global challenges all on their own. This is a 21st century way of responding to a more diversified, dispersed world.
Minister Jaishankar, if it's all right, I'll begin with you. We just heard about how France and Europe in general are contributing to Indo-Pacific security. But since we are in Europe, I'd like to ask you how India is contributing to European security. India has spoken out vociferously against China for its actions on the disputed border between India and China. But India, however, has abstained from voting on Ukraine in the UN Security Council. Could you please help me understand if India's position is that different principles should apply in different parts of the world?
Well, I don't think the situations in the Indo-Pacific and the transatlantic are really analogous. And certainly the assumption in your question that somehow there's a trade-off and, one country does this in the Pacific, so in return you do something else. I don't think that's the way international relations work. We have, I think, quite distinct challenges. What's happening here, what's happening in the Indo-Pacific. In fact, if there was a connection by that logic, you would have had a lot of European powers very early taking very sharp positions in the Indo-Pacific, and we didn't see that. We haven't seen that since 2009. So now, yes, there is now, from last year, a EU strategy. What you spoke about in your remarks, France, Germany, Netherlands, these are all very recent developments. And the problem in Indo-Pacific is not recent. So I would say you really need to look at that question again.
So you disagree that principles, the international rules-based order, international law, you disagree that that should apply across the world uniformly?
No, I think I would say principles and interests are balanced. And if people were so principled in this part of the world, they would have been practicing the principles in Asia or in Afghanistan before we've actually seen them do.
Let's move on to the next question to you. And moving away from Europe now, India's relations with China took a sharp downturn in, I think it was around June 2020, given the Ladakh crisis on your border. What has the crisis meant for India-China strategy, India's China strategy? And has it meant a decisive and enduring shift towards the West?
It has, look, it's a problem we are having with China. And the problem is this, that for 45 years, there was peace, there was stable border management. There were no military casualties on the border from 1975. That changed because we had agreements with China not to bring military forces to we call it border, but it's line of actual control. And the Chinese violated those agreements. Now, the state of the border will determine the Chinese violated those agreements. Now, the state of the border will determine the state of the relationship. In this world, no country, not even the United States today, has the ability to address big global challenges all on their own. This is a 21st century way of responding to a more diversified, dispersed world.
Minister Jayashankar, if it's all right, I'll begin with you. We just heard about how France and Europe in general are contributing to Indo-Pacific security. But since we are in Europe, I'd like to ask you how India is contributing to European security. India has spoken out vociferously against China for its actions on the disputed border between India and China. But India, however, has abstained from voting on Ukraine in the UN Security Council. Could you please help me understand if India's position is that different principles should apply in different parts of the world?
Well, I don't think the situations in the Indo-Pacific and the transatlantic are really analogous. And certainly the assumption in your question that somehow there's a trade-off and one country does this in the Pacific, so in return you do something else. I don't think that's the way international relations work. We have, I think, quite distinct challenges. What's happening here, what's happening in the Indo-Pacific. In fact, if there was a connection by that logic, you would have had a lot of European powers very early taking very sharp positions in the Indo-Pacific, and we didn't see that. We haven't seen that since 2009. So now, yes, there is now, from last year, a EU strategy. What you spoke about in your remarks, France, Germany, Netherlands, these are all very recent developments. And the problem in Indo-Pacific is not recent. So I would say you really need to look at that question again.
So you disagree that principles, the international rules-based order, international law, you disagree that that should apply across the world uniformly?
No, I think I would say principles and interests are balanced. And if people were so principled in this part of the world, they would have been practicing the principles in Asia or in Afghanistan before we've actually seen them do.
Let's move on to the next question to you. And moving away from Europe now, India's relations with China took a sharp downturn in, I think it was around June 2020, given the Ladakh crisis on your border. What has the crisis meant for India-China strategy, India's China strategy? And has it meant a decisive and enduring shift towards the West?
It has, look, it's a problem we are having with China. And the problem is this, that for 45 years, there was peace, there was stable border management. There were no military casualties on the border from 1975. That changed because we had agreements with China not to bring military forces to we call it border, but it's line of actual control. And the Chinese violated those agreements. Now, the state of the border will determine the state of the relationship. That's natural. So obviously, relations with China right now are going through a very difficult phase. But I would quite honestly again question your question, that therefore our relations with the West are better. My relations with the West were quite decent before June 2020. So again, I would challenge that correlation that you're making.
Perhaps just one more question on India and Southeast Asia. Prime Minister Modi has a look enact East policy. He's sought to focus more on Southeast Asia. However, a recent poll, in fact, I think it was published just last week, indicates that on this occasion of the 30th anniversary of ASEAN-India relations, which we celebrate this year, at this time, levels of trust between Southeast Asian countries and India are fairly low. India ranks fifth after Japan, the United States, the EU, China, and only 16.6% of respondents in this poll have said that they have confidence in India. What do you think India can do better to leverage its great soft power in the region?
I'm a politician, so I believe in polls, but I've never seen a poll which has made any sense to me when it comes to foreign policy. So I guess the one you cited probably is part of a long list there. But I would say that our relations right now with ASEAN are actually growing well. If I were to actually look at the evolution, the two big changes which are taking place, we have much stronger security cooperation with ASEAN. I've just come from a trip to the Philippines, where we've actually signed agreements for military supplies to the Philippines. We are part of ADMM Plus. We have strong bilateral relations with Singapore, Indonesia, and Vietnam, amongst others. And the other is physical connectivity. So I hate to challenge you for the fourth time, but I don't think that poll's very good.
It's good to still be considered as young and be back here in Munich. The first informal meeting of Quad, I think, was in Manila, and it was a decade later that the leaders of Quad actually, again in Manila, came to meet each other. Recently, we had a presidential debate in the Philippines, and it seems even our
y contaban entre sus filas con el hoy héroe nacional, Capitán Juan José Abelardo Quiñones González, gran general del aire del Perú. Este grupo de valerosos paracaidistas intervino en el famoso salto masivo del
ADMM Plus. We have strong bilateral relations with Singapore, Indonesia, and Vietnam, amongst others. And the other is physical connectivity. So I hate to challenge you for the fourth time, but I don't think that poll's very good.
It's good to still be considered as young and be back here in Munich. The first informal meeting of Quad, I think, was in Manila, and it was a decade later that the leaders of Quad, actually again in Manila, came to meet each other. Recently, we had a president.
We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
Debate in the Philippines, and it seems
We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
Anything else exciting going on?
Of course.
Watch for traffic.
Hey, my man. Up for something new?
Anytime.
Hey, Lexus, read my newest message.
Our spot, sunrise.
The all-new Lexus RX.
Looking good.
Always.
Never lose your edge.
Y en este momento propiamente ya el desfile sigue su curso en el Zócalo de la Ciudad de México. ¿Qué estamos viendo en este momento?
En este momento estamos viendo el grupo de Fuerzas Especiales de Reacción e Intervención. Es un grupo de reciente creación de la Guardia Nacional. Se creó, pasó revista de entrada el 16 de agosto de este año, con aproximadamente 500 elementos. Es un grupo que se encarga de llegar o realizar operaciones táctico-operativas a cualquier lugar del territorio. Tiene armamento especializado y su adiestramiento también es especializado para este tipo de ocasiones o situaciones críticas donde se requiera más elementos.
Sí, porque hoy destacadamente este 16 de septiembre la Guardia Nacional tiene pues los mayores contingentes numéricamente hablando en este desfile, y en este momento también vemos a los aviones de la Fuerza Aérea Mexicana también haciendo esta figura con colores de los colores nacionales, el verde, blanco y el rojo, ¿verdad?
Así es pues nuestro lavado patrio. Y estos aviones son los T-6C, como mencionaba, son aviones para la seguridad del espacio aéreo o para acompañar alguna aeronave, como puede ser defensa aérea o sombrilla aérea.
Sí, y es que cuando pensamos en las Fuerzas Armadas de nuestro país, nada más es cuestión de reflexionar el número de integrantes, la capacidad que deben de tener para custodiar un país tan vasto, tan inmenso que es nuestro territorio nacional. Tanto el Ejército de Tierra, la Fuerza Aérea como la Marina. Caramba, somos un país que tiene infinidad de costas del lado Pacífico, del lado del Golfo de México, del Mar Caribe, y esta tarea también destacada, por supuesto, la tiene que realizar la Secretaría de Marina Armada de México.
Y precisamente, Héctor, en este desfile o en esta vigilancia aérea participan, bueno, y ahorita en este desfile participan 2 pilotos femeninos que se están integrando y están muy bien adiestradas para realizar este tipo de evento. Y sí, precisamente nuestras aeronaves las empleamos para la inspección de nuestros mares territoriales, nuestro espacio aéreo.
Sí, efectivamente, y mientras seguimos viendo, entiendo, son contingentes, todavía continúan de la Guardia Nacional, ¿verdad?
Así es, todo el 70% primero del desfile es de la Guardia Nacional. Eso estamos viendo los diferentes tipos de uniformes que utiliza la Guardia Nacional. Pasó un contingente anteriormente con el uniforme de proximidad. El que vemos es el uniforme de campo que utilizan. Ahí volvemos a ver nuevamente el uniforme de proximidad, que es con el que realiza sus actividades para entablar conversaciones, es parte de las atribuciones de la Guardia Nacional, crear proximidad social. Es algo muy importante que venimos realizando día a día en la Guardia Nacional.
Sí, y bueno, se distingue el uniforme de la Guardia Nacional en sus distintas corporaciones por este color gris, ¿verdad? ¿Es fundamentalmente de color gris?
Así es, el de campo es un pixelado gris, que lo utilizamos para nuestras labores cotidianas. El de proximidad viene siendo camisa y pantalón negro con gorra de guarnición.
Y bueno, estos elementos de la Guardia Nacional ya había desfilado también en previos desfiles como parte del 16 de septiembre, ¿no?
Así es, este es nuestro cuarto desfile. El 30 de junio cumplimos 3 años de la creación del pase de entrada de la Guardia Nacional y este es nuestro cuarto desfile. Es la segunda ocasión que abrimos un desfile, pero es la primera con un contingente mayor que las otras Fuerzas Armadas.
Sí, porque bueno, este año tiene una connotación, digamos, distinta. Se ha dado desde el andamiaje jurídico aprobado en la Cámara de Diputados, pues esta transferencia del mando operativo y administrativo de la Guardia Nacional a la Secretaría de la Defensa Nacional, y también se quiere connotar esto, ¿no? La necesidad de tener elementos de seguridad pública con adiestramiento militar, ciertamente con preparación y formación militar, para garantizar esto que desde luego siempre es el propósito, el ideal, el sueño de todo gobierno, garantizar la seguridad, la paz en territorio nacional, y por eso este desfile, destacadamente la participación de la Guardia Nacional. También escuchábamos en los discursos tanto del titular de la Secretaría de la Defensa Nacional como del secretario de Marina, este reconocimiento importante a la Guardia Nacional, que además la gran parte de sus efectivos tuvo su origen, su formación en la Secretaría de la Defensa Nacional.
Sí, claro, como lo comentas, Héctor, ¿no? Todas las instalaciones militares se han estado usando en beneficio y para el adiestramiento de la Guardia Nacional. En los planteles militares tenemos personal de cadetes que se encuentran formando para la Guardia Nacional, pero ya directamente en funciones de seguridad pública, ¿verdad? Que es la parte esencial de la Guardia Nacional.
In response to the Boxing Day the Chinese violated those agreements. Now, the state of the border will determine the state of the relationship. In this world, no country, not even the United States today, has the ability to address big global challenges all on their own. This is a 21st century way of responding to a more diversified, dispersed world.
Minister Jayashankar, if it's all right, I'll begin with you. We just heard about how France and Europe in general are contributing to Indo-Pacific security. But since we are in Europe, I'd like to ask you how India is contributing to European security. India has spoken out vociferously against China for its actions on the disputed border between India and China. But India, however, has abstained from voting on Ukraine in the UN Security Council. Could you please help me understand if India's position is that different principles should apply in different parts of the world?
Well, I don't think the situations in the Indo-Pacific and the transatlantic are really analogous. And certainly the assumption in your question that somehow there's a trade-off and, you know, one country does this in the Pacific, so in return you do something else. I don't think that's the way international relations work. We have, I think, quite distinct challenges. What's happening here, what's happening in the Indo-Pacific. In fact, if there was a connection by that logic, you would have had a lot of European powers very early taking very sharp positions in the Indo-Pacific, and we didn't see that. We haven't seen that since 2009. So now, yes, there is now, from last year, a EU strategy. What you spoke about in your remarks, France, Germany, Netherlands, these are all very recent developments. And the problem in Indo-Pacific is not recent. So I would say you really need to look at that question again.
So you disagree that principles, the international rules-based order, international law, you disagree that that should apply across the world uniformly?
No, I think I would say principles and interests are balanced. And if people were so principled in this part of the world, they would have been practicing the principles in Asia or in Afghanistan before we've actually seen them do.
Let's move on to the next question to you. And moving away from Europe now, India's relations with China took a sharp downturn in, I think it was around June 2020, given the Ladakh crisis on your border. What has the crisis meant for India-China strategy, India's China strategy? And has it meant a decisive and enduring shift towards the West?
It has, look, it's a problem we are having with China. And the problem is this, that for 45 years, there was peace, there was stable border management. There were no military casualties on the border from 1975. That changed. Because we had agreements with China not to bring military forces to the, no, I mean, we call it border, but it's line of actual control. And the Chinese violated those agreements. Now, the state of the border will determine the state of the relationship. That's natural. So obviously, relations with China right now are going through a very difficult phase. But I would quite honestly again question your question, that therefore our relations with the West are better. My relations with the West were quite decent before June 2020. So again, I would challenge that, correlation that you're making.
Perhaps just one more question on India and Southeast Asia. Prime Minister Modi has look east, enact east policy. He's sought to focus more on Southeast Asia. However, a recent poll, in fact, I think it was published just last week, indicates that on this occasion of the 30th anniversary of ASEAN-India relations, which we celebrate this year, at this time, levels of trust between Southeast Asian countries and India are fairly low. India ranks 5th after Japan, the United States, the EU, China, and only 16.6% of respondents in this poll have said that they have confidence in India. What do you think India can do better to leverage its great soft power in the region?
I'm a politician, so I believe in polls, but I've never seen a poll which has made any sense to me when it comes to foreign policy. So I guess the one you cited probably is part of a long list there. But I would say that our relations right now with the ASEAN are actually growing well. I mean, if I were to actually look at the evolution, the two big changes which are taking place, we have much stronger security cooperation with the ASEAN. I've just come from a trip to the Philippines, where we've actually signed agreements for military supplies to the Philippines. We are part of ADMM Plus. We have strong bilateral relations with Singapore, Indonesia, and Vietnam, amongst others. And the other is physical connectivity. So I hate to challenge you for the 4th time, but I don't think that poll's very good.
It's good to still be considered as young and be back here in Munich. The first informal meeting of Quad, I think, was in Manila, and it was a decade later that the leaders of Quad actually, again in Manila, came to meet each other. Recently, we had a presidential debate in the Philippines, and it seems even our presidential candidates don't know what is the Quad all about. Can you tell us about Quad? What is it? Is it the Asian NATO? Is it a NATO with Asian characteristics? Is it just an ad hoc body? And to what degree does the evolution of Quad, maybe in the next 10 years, tethered to behavior of China? And by that matter, also calculus of India, because we have 3 treaty allies here. India is not. So I think, to what degree does China and India's calculus play into the trajectory of Quad in the next decade or so? Thank you very much.
I assume that's at me, right? Look, you know, the first time the Quad countries came together was actually in 2004 in response to the Boxing Day tsunami. I had an association with it. I was the country coordinator, in a sense, for India for that response. Then their representatives met in 2007, as you said, in Manila, but the countries were not sufficiently invested in it politically, so they kind of let it fritter away. And then they met again a decade later, in 2017, in September, this time at a higher level of a sort of permanent secretary, vice minister sort of level. 2019, it became ministers, which was when we first met, and 2021, it's become a summit. Now, what is the Quad about? You know, it's in a sense natural, because partly you're sitting in Europe, but also because all of us pull out concepts from pre-existing lexicon to say it's an Asian NATO, because it's a very convenient, if completely misleading term, but it's still very convenient. And of course, there are interested parties who advance that kind of analogy. I would put it to you as 4 countries who have common interests, common values, a great deal of comfort. Now, obviously, if there are challenges to global norms, global order, to international law, to rules-based order, it makes sense that, you know, anybody who's working for the good will also look at challenges to the good. So I would urge you not to slip into that, I mean, forgive my saying so, that lazy analogy of an ASEAN NATO. It isn't, because there are 3 countries who are treaty allies. We're not a treaty ally. Quad doesn't have a treaty, it doesn't have a structure, it doesn't have a secretariat. It's a kind of this is a 21st century way of responding to a more diversified, dispersed world. Sorry for a long answer, but I thought it's a good explanation. The Chinese violated those agreements. Now, the state of the border will determine the state of the relationship. In this world, no country, not even the United States today, has the ability to address big global challenges all on their own. This is a 21st century way of responding to a more diversified, dispersed world.
Minister Jayashankar, if it's all right, I'll begin with you. We just heard about how France and Europe in general are contributing to Indo-Pacific security. But since we are in Europe, I'd like to ask you how India is contributing to European security. India has spoken out vociferously against China for its actions on the disputed border between India and China. But India, however, has abstained from voting on Ukraine in the UN Security Council. Could you please help me understand if India's position is that different principles should apply in different parts of the world?
Well, I don't think the situations in the Indo-Pacific and the transatlantic are really analogous. And certainly the assumption in your question that somehow there's a trade-off and one country does this in the Pacific, so in return you do something else. I don't think that's the way international relations work. We have, I think, quite distinct challenges. What's happening here, what's happening in the Indo-Pacific. In fact, if there was a connection by that logic, you would have had a lot of European powers very early taking very sharp positions in the Indo-Pacific, and we didn't see that. We haven't seen that since 2009. So now, yes, there is now, from last year, a EU strategy. What you spoke about in your remarks, France, Germany, Netherlands, these are all very recent developments. And the problem in Indo-Pacific is not recent. So I would say you really need to look at that question again.
So you disagree that principles, the international rules-based order, international law, you disagree that that should apply across the world uniformly?
No, I think I would say principles and interests are balanced. And if people were so principled in this part of the world, they would have been practicing the principles in Asia or in Afghanistan before we've actually seen them do.
Let's move on to the next question to you. And moving away from Europe now, India's relations with China took a sharp downturn in, I think it was around June 2020, given the Ladakh crisis on your border. What has the crisis meant for India-China strategy, India's China strategy? And has it meant a decisive and enduring shift towards the West?
It has, look, it's a problem we are having with China. And the problem is this, that for 45 years, there was peace. There was stable border management. There were no military casualties on the border from 1975. That changed because we had agreements with China not to bring military forces to we call it border, but it's line of actual control. And the Chinese violated those agreements. Now, the state of the border will determine the state of the relationship. That's natural. So obviously, relations with China right now are going through a very difficult phase. But I would quite honestly again question your question that therefore our relations with the West are better. My relations with the West were quite decent before June 20. Now,
given the Ladakh crisis on your border. What has the crisis meant for India-China strategy, India's China strategy? And has it meant a decisive and enduring shift towards the West?
It has, look, it's a problem we are having with China. And the problem is this, that for 45 years, there was peace, there was stable border management. There were no military casualties on the border from 1975. That changed because we had agreements with China not to bring military forces to we call it border, but it's line of actual control. And the Chinese violated those agreements. Now, the state of the border will determine the state of the relationship. That's natural. So obviously, relations with China right now are going through a very difficult phase. But I would quite honestly again question your question that therefore our relations with the West are better. My relations with the West were quite decent before June 2020. So again, I would challenge that correlation that you're making.
Perhaps just one more question on India and Southeast Asia. Prime Minister Modi has enact East policy. He's sought to focus more on Southeast Asia. However, a recent poll, in fact, I think it was published just last week, indicates that on this occasion of the 30th anniversary of ASEAN-India relations, which we celebrate this year, at this time, levels of trust between Southeast Asian countries and India are fairly low. India ranks 5th after Japan, the United States, the EU, China, and only 16.6% of respondents in this poll have said that they have confidence in India. What do you think India can do better to leverage its great soft power in the region?
I'm a politician, so I believe in polls, but I've never seen a poll which has made any sense to me when it comes to foreign policy. So I guess the one you cited probably is part of a long list there. But I would say that our relations right now with ASEAN are actually growing well. If I were to actually look at the evolution, the two big changes which are taking place, we have much stronger security cooperation with ASEAN. I've just come from a trip to the Philippines, where we've actually signed agreements for military supplies to the Philippines. We are part of ADMM+. We have strong bilateral relations with Singapore, Indonesia, and Vietnam, amongst others. And the other is physical connectivity. So I hate to challenge you for the 4th time, but I don't think that poll's very good.
It's good to still be considered as young and be back here in Munich. The first informal meeting of Quad, I think, was in Manila, and it was a decade later that the leaders of Quad actually, again in Manila, came to meet each other. Recently, we had a presidential debate in the Philippines, and it seems even our presidential candidates don't know what is the Quad all about. Can you tell us about Quad? What is it? Is it the Asian NATO? Is it a NATO with Asian characteristics? Is it just an ad hoc body? And to what degree does the evolution of Quad, maybe in the next 10 years, tethered to behavior of China? And by that matter, also calculus of India, because we have 3 treaty allies here, India is not. So I think, to what degree does China and India's calculus play into the trajectory of Quad in the next decade or so? Thank you very much.
I assume that's at me, right? Look, you know, the first time the Quad countries came together was actually in 2004. In response to the Boxing Day tsunami. I had an association with it. I was the country coordinator, in a sense, for India for that. Response. Then their representatives met in 2007, as you said, in Manila, but the countries were not sufficiently invested in it politically, so they kind of let it fritter away. And then they met again a decade later. In 2017, in September, this time at a higher level of a sort of permanent secretary, vice minister sort of level. 2019, it became ministers, which was when we first met. And in 2021, it's become a summit. Now, what is the Quad about? You know, it's in a sense natural, because partly you're sitting in Europe, but also because all of us pull out concepts from pre-existing lexicon to say it's an Asian NATO, because it's a very convenient, if completely misleading term, but it's still very convenient. And of course, there are interested parties who advance that kind of analogy. I would put it to you as 4 countries who have common interests, common values, a great deal of comfort. Now, obviously, if there are challenges to global norms, global order, to international law, to rules-based order, it makes sense that, you know, anybody who's working for the good will also look at challenges to the good. So I would urge you not to slip into that, I mean, forgive my saying so, that lazy analogy of an ASEAN NATO. It isn't, because there are 3 countries who are treaty allies. We're not a treaty ally. Quad doesn't have a treaty, it doesn't have a structure, it doesn't have a secretariat. It's a kind of this is a 21st century way of responding to a more diversified, dispersed world. Sorry for a long answer, but I thought it's a good explanation. You know, in 2016, we were, I think, among the first, or probably the first country who actually laid out in detail our connectivity policy. And we did so because we could see there was a building debate about strategic connectivity, how to use connectivity for strategic purposes. Essentially what we suggested was that connectivity should be transparent, it should be commercially based, it should have local buy-ins, it should not create debt, it should be environmentally and ecologically friendly, it should not be unilateral, and it should not violate the sovereignty and territorial integrity of countries. It should not be built unilaterally by other countries. There are competitive offers for development projects. Why should countries not take advantage of it? I mean, if I could rephrase it in a way. You know, that look, it's international relations is competitive. Every country will look for opportunities and see what it can do. But while doing so, it's in their own interest to be prudent about what they're getting into, to do the due diligence. We have seen now countries, including in our region, being saddled with large debts. We have seen projects which are commercially unsustainable, airports where an aircraft doesn't come, harbors where a ship doesn't come. So I think people would be justified in asking themselves, what am I getting into? You know, it's obviously in the interest of the country concerned, but it's also in the interest of the international community, because unsustainable projects don't end there. They then often the next is debt becomes equity, and that becomes something else.
Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
It's a pleasure to be back at the Atlantic Council. Let me begin actually by recognizing two people who are not here, but who for me in many ways were the engagement when I was ambassador and earlier, which is Fred Kemp and John Huntsman. And I'm delighted to, I know many of you, but I'm particularly delighted to see Ambassador Dobriansky, because the two of us worked on the kind of issues that I'm going to talk about when we were both in the administration. So, look, when I thought I should come and, avail of your invitation, I felt I should really address what is the core mission of this institution, which was initially, to my understanding, a body which was set up to promote transatlantic understanding, and then has grown beyond that to actually take on the responsibility of engaging the world beyond the transatlantic world as well. So my remarks today are really focused on those sets of issues, which in a sense you could say, how does India relate to the West? How does the West hopefully relate to India? And where do we go on from here? Now, many of you would have heard in another country the term a century of humiliation. Okay. India actually had 2 centuries of humiliation with the West, because the West kind of in its predatory form came into India in the mid-18th century and continued almost exactly for 190 years after that. And it was interesting, I think a year ago, there was actually a very serious economic study which tried to estimate how much the British took out of India in value terms. And a very calculated math ended up put a number of $45 trillion at today's value. So that should give you a sense of really what happened in those 200 years. So while we will speak of all the things we shared today, the reality also is that the history of India and the West is also a history of really of famine, of slavery, of opium trade. So there is a very dark side to all of this. Now, this is the 150th anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi. It's almost on October 2nd is actually the birth anniversary. And I think it's worth a while to pause and reflect on how a leader like him actually changed India's attitude towards the West. That in 1947, when India got independence, it need not have had the kind of relationship with the West which it did thereafter. We can debate the merits of it, but I think it's extraordinary in a way that a country which struggled so long for its independence, after that actually kind of reached informal understanding or a compact, in a sense, with the West. And I would sort of regard that as really the ability to set history aside and allow, politics and economics and social connections to take over. So what you don't see in India and have not seen for the last 70 years, even at the most difficult times with the West, has been a kind of mobilization around an anti-Western sort of nationalism. That it has been actually, in many ways, I would say, a cordial relationships. If it was not cordial, it was certainly not frictional. And part of that was also the way we, set up our own institutions and created our own society. And at the end of the day, the fact that we are a liberal democracy, the fact that there is a governance model based on rule of law, the fact that there is social pluralism, and that we are a market economy. I think these were all really very powerful factors which actually enabled us to put that history behind us. And here I would make one point before shifting to my next argument, which is that India's choices in 1947 and thereafter actually took what were Western values and Western practices and made them near universal. So today, if you have in the developed world or the South, or whatever you call it, really Asia, Africa, parts of Latin America, if you have today a belief that democracy is an ethically superior model of governance, in part it is due to the fact that the first big post-colonial polity actually chose that and then sustained it despite extraordinary odds over the last 70 years. So let's look at the last 70 years, and these last 70 years have really been a very complex history. At one level, I would say the West has actually been very, very supportive of India's growth, India's rise, if you would. You can see that in politics, you can see that in security, in trade, in investment, in services, in education. In particularly in the 50s, 60s, 70s, in development assistance of various kinds. You can see that in the where the Indian diaspora, particularly the more modern voluntary diaspora, is located, and the I would say, that 40s to perhaps the late 90s, I mean, let's say the 20th century in that sense. This was a period where actually this what I described, a cordial, non-frictional relationship was largely in play, and I think it's had a very invaluable role really in building the India that we have today. But having said that, it is what I would call a sort of a Goldilocks era of our relationship, which is the West didn't want India to get too weak, it didn't want India to get too strong, so it stirred the Indian porridge, or tried to stir the Indian porridge just right, and sometimes, got it, say there were margins of error on either side. So you actually have a very interesting sort of situation where when India, in 1962, after the conflict where we were defeated, actually the West comes to the assistance of India. But in less than a decade, in 1971, when it seems to the West that India is seeking a primacy in the subcontinent, the West opposes India. So there's a sort of a bandwidth in which the relationship operates. Now, this bandwidth is not just episodic. I mean, if you look, where is it? Not like tomorrow morning everything is going to be cut off. So people need to understand, if you can be considerate of yourself, surely you can be considerate of other people. So if a Europe says, look, we have to manage it in a way in which its impact on my economy is not traumatic. That freedom or that choice should exist for other people as well. Europe has to grow out of the mindset that Europe's problems are the world's problems. But the world's problems are not Europe's problems. That if it is you, it's yours. If it is me, it's ours. There is a linkage today which is being made. A linkage between China and India and what's happening in Ukraine. So come on, guys. I mean, China and India happened way before anything happened in Ukraine. We have a difficult relationship with China. We're perfectly capable of managing it. It's if I get global understanding and support, obviously it is of help to me. But this idea that I do a transaction, that I come in one conflict because it will help me in conflict too, that's not how the world works. So a lot of our problems in China have nothing to do with Ukraine, have nothing to do with Russia. They predate it.
Shankar, there will always be two axes at this point. I think it's an understood, accepted fact that you have the West, US-led, you have China as the next potential axis. Where does India fit into this? Are you planning to not take a side?
No, I'm sorry. That is exactly where I disagree with you. This is the construct you are trying to impose on me, and I don't accept it. I mean, I don't think it's necessary for me to join this axis or not, and if I'm not joining this, I must be with the other one. I don't accept that. I mean, I think I'm 1/5 of the world's population. I am today the 5th or 6th largest economy in the world. I mean, forget the history, civilization bit, everybody knows that. But I think I'm entitled to have my own side. I'm entitled to weigh my own interests, make my own choices. And my choices will not be cynical and transactional, but they will be a balance of my values and my interests. There is no country in the world which disregards its interests. The wheat was actually being stocked for being traded. So in a way, our goodwill was being used for speculation. Mm-hmm. So we had to do something to stop that, because it was also impacting us at home. Our prices were going up. So I want to be very clear what we have done. We have actually said, look, we're not going to give speculators an open access to the Indian market, so that the Indian customer and the LDCs of the world get the short end of that. Yeah. And preventing a diversion to high-income countries with a greater possibility to buy, because what we saw happen with the vaccines, we don't want to see happen with the wheat, which was the rich people got vaccinated and the poor were left to God and changing Germany's kitchen in the space of a few years. So there's a lot going on there. And why I mention that is many of the global developments today have the potential of actually putting that under stress. Your second reference was to China. Yes, we are going through a particularly difficult patch in our relationship with China. We've had differences in the past, but we've never had a situation where, after 1962, where really agreements on not bringing forces to the border have been disregarded. A very large number of forces have been brought to the border. We've had a clash. People have died. And this has not happened now. It happened 2 years ago. So in a sense, it's a bit of a diversion, but it's also a useful reminder to Europe that there were other things happening in the rest of the world which sometimes Europe perhaps doesn't pay enough attention to. There's also been Afghanistan, what happened there, the circumstances in which the Western, particularly American military forces left finally. And now we have Ukraine, and coming into this region, it's a region which I know well. I have lived here in Budapest and in Prague. It's a region which has been very helpful to us when we wanted to get 20,000 students out of Ukraine. Slovakia, Hungary, Poland, Romania, even Moldova. But I think it's also important for people in the region to realize how this is playing out in the rest of the world, that it is creating a huge fuel crisis, a food crisis, a fertilizer crisis, pushing inflation in low-income societies which don't have the margins really to absorb that. And so it can very quickly become political in many societies.
I think that brings up an interesting question that's come in from an online audience member, which is relevant to this, this point that you make about the rest of the world versus right here, right now in Europe or in the West. How interested are the Indian people in the war in Ukraine? Is it a major concern? Is it a minor concern? And you've kind of alluded to the fact that it's affecting fuel, it's affecting food, but how interested is the populace itself?
I think it's a major concern. It's a major concern for two reasons. Look, today our existence is very connected. I mean, everybody sees things on the television, on their phones, on the net. So wherever you are, and because bear in mind today India is a very digital society. Even people at lower levels of income, the one thing they do have is the connectivity. So there is a lot of awareness. I don't think anybody, everybody is, to put it mildly, disturbed at the conflict. They see the pictures, they see that happening. But the other part of it is begun to impact people's daily lives. That it's impacting the petrol cost at the bank. It is impacting your wheat cost in your shopping. It will have impact for farmers to get along with sowing. And I think businesses when it impacts business, because it is impacting business in multiple ways. There's a container problem, there's an insurance problem. You don't get certain commodities, or if you do, the prices are up. So it's disrupting life. And it's not a unicausal disruption. At the same time, I think some of the lockdowns in China are also having an economic impact. But when you disrupt the economy, it shows up in employment. So I think it does trouble people. Trouble people is a very very.
Well, it's a job of a government. I understand it would trouble people. I think it troubles people in the West as well when cost of living crisis starts hitting. At some point, when you look at global supply chains, this is a very different world in 2022 that we operate in versus, say, in 1991 pre-liberalization, when India could afford to stand by non-alignment as it was defined then. I think a lot of critics would ask you the increase in your oil imports that have happened between 2021 and 2022, it's 9 times higher as of this month. You have been questioned in terms of that increased oil import from Russia, $95 a barrel for Russian oil, 119 approximately for Brent crude. Is that profiteering? Is that looking out for your own interest? What does that really mean for foreign policy in India? And how do you tie non-alignment with 9 times more oil imports out of Russia? How do you make the two meet?
Well, look, first of all, I don't see a non-alignment oil connection at all. I mean, today Europe is buying oil. Europe is buying gas. I just read the new package of sanctions. Now, the package is designed in a way in which consideration has been given to the welfare of the population. So, pipelines have a certain carve-out. And timelines have been given. It's not like tomorrow morning everything is going to be cut off. So, people need to understand, if you can be considerate of yourself, surely you can be considerate of other people. So, if Europe says, look, we have to manage it in a way in which its impact on my economy is not traumatic. That freedom or that choice should exist for other people as well. Now, in terms of our oil purchases, we don't send people out there saying, go buy Russian oil. We send people out there saying, go buy oil. Now, you buy the best oil you can in the market. So I don't think I would attach a political messaging to that. I would also...
How do you not conflate the two? I mean, I know the Indian-Russian relationship is strong, but you also have issues with China. How do you then sit back and define Indian foreign policy at this point where the West seems to be quite vociferous in trying to curtail funding for the war in Ukraine, whereas by purchasing this oil for national interest, India is being asked, are you funding this war?
So, look, I mean, I don't want to sound argumentative, but then tell me if buying Russian gas is not funding the war? I mean, why is it's only Indian money and oil coming to India which funds, but it's not gas coming to Europe which funds? I mean, look, somewhere, I mean, let's be a little even-handed out here. And even this, look, the whole narrative that it's gone up 9 times. I mean, it's gone up 9 times from a very low base. And it was a very low base because at that time the markets were more open. Why if countries in Europe and the West and the United States are so concerned, why don't they allow Iranian oil to come into the market? Why don't they allow Venezuelan oil to come into the market? I mean, they've squeezed every other source of oil we have, and then say, okay, guys, you must not go into the market and get the best deal for your people. I don't think that's a very fair approach.
So talk to us about the second aspect that Indian foreign policy is being questioned at this point when it comes to wheat bans and food bans of exports. How does that then correlate? Because we're talking about the global south and the east that is being squeezed by Russia's issues with allowing Ukrainian grains to be exported. But by India doing the same, again, aren't those weakest people in the world being subjected to the same kind of issues from India? Do you see that as supporting Russia, or is it a completely different element that we don't understand in the West, that your perspective is different?
I think answer is B. You don't understand in the West. But it isn't just the West, okay? I don't think people understand because they're not actually tracking the trade. Well, we have been exporting wheat. Okay, typically we export about 2 to 3 million tons. Last financial year was a better year. We exported about 7 million tons. This year, before the heat wave hit us very badly, the expectation was that we would do substantial exports, and we were open. I mean, in fact, Prime Minister himself had said on various occasions, saying, look, we see that there's a food crisis in the world and we'd like to be of help. But what we then saw was a kind of run on our wheat, a large part of it done by international traders based out of Singapore and I think to some degree maybe Dubai. The result was actually the low-income countries, many of whom were our traditional buyers, like our neighbors, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal. These are our traditional buyers. Okay. Interestingly, the Gulf buys regularly from us. I heard Dr. Tedros in the earlier session talk about Yemen. Yemen buys from us. Sudan buys from us. Okay. Now, what we saw was the low-income buyers were being squeezed out. The wheat was actually being stocked for being traded. So in a way, our goodwill was being used for speculation. Mm-hmm. So we had to do something to stop that because it was also impacting us at home. Our prices were going up. So I want to be very clear what we have done. We have actually said, look, we're not going to give speculators an open access to the Indian market so that the Indian customer and the LDCs of the world get the short end of that. Yeah. What we are still open to doing is where we see a kind of a deserving country wanting wheat, very glad to supply it within the realm of possibility. And just for the record, I think we've done this year wheat exports to about 23 countries. The rate of export this year, if I were to take the same period as last year, my rough sense is it's about 4x.
Okay.
So actually, it's gone up. And I know in many cases, foreign ministers of some countries have called me up and we have assured them that they would have access to our markets.
So this is all about stopping and curtailing speculation at the end of the day.
That's right. And preventing a diversion to high-income countries with a greater possibility to buy, because what we saw happen with the vaccines, we don't want to see happen with the wheat, which was the rich people got vaccinated and the poor were left to God and
well, that brings up a question again from the audience now, and I would like to ask, I will come to you. I want to just do one question from the online audience, which kind of follows up on your point of diversions. This person's asking, according to the Wall Street Journal, India is becoming a key point for transshipment of Russian oil to bypass sanctions. How does that serve India's foreign policy interests?
I don't know. Does whoever wrote that knows what transshipment means? Well, I mean, transshipment is when you get it. No, when you get it and you sell it to somebody else. I have not even heard of anybody in India thinking along those lines. So yes, we do buy.
So you're saying the Wall Street Journal report is inaccurate that they're quoting?
Politely, yes.
Okay. So
I can say it less politely,
India is
but
not a conduit to any Russian oil transactions.
No, not at all. I mean, listen. Please understand the oil markets. There's an enormous shortage of oil. There's a physical shortage of oil. Getting access to oil is difficult. I mean, a country like India would be crazy to get oil from somebody and sell it to somebody else. I mean, this is nonsense.
So that is your question answered, and the minister's on the record. Yes, please. If you could stand up, give us your name and a brief question.
Konstantin Eggert, freelance journalist from Vilnius, Lithuania. Dr. Jaishankar, with the Indian government essentially ignoring war crimes in Ukraine, not condemning Russia, not doing sanctions, you then expect, I'm totally sorry, I know what I do, with India counting on global support for in its struggle with China, its issues with China. How do you think you'll be trusted by others after that? Why do you think anyone will help Delhi after you didn't help others over Ukraine? Thank you.
You know, it's an interesting question which you might, I mean, not you, meaning you personally, but people might want to ask themselves, because if I were to take Europe collectively, which has been singularly silent on many things which were happening, for example, in Asia, you could ask, why would anybody in Asia trust Europe on anything at all? So here's the take. I don't think, I mean, first of all, I think you're mischaracterizing our position, where they have, for example, when Bucha happened, we condemned Bucha, and we actually asked for an investigation into Bucha. In terms of what is happening with the Ukraine conflict, our position is very clearly that we favor an immediate cessation of hostilities. It's not that we've ignored it, unless you call phone calls to Putin and Zelensky as ignoring something. So first, I would urge you to get the factual position accurately. Secondly, in terms of the connection you are making, look, you know, we have a difficult relationship with China. We're perfectly capable of managing it. It's, if I get global understanding and support, obviously it is of help to me. But this idea that I do a transaction, that I come in one conflict because it will help me in conflict too, that's not how the world works. So a lot of our problems in China have nothing to do with Ukraine, have nothing to do with Russia. They predate it. And there are, I mean, if we are getting into who is silent on what issue at what point of time, I could point to a whole lot of issues on which, as I said, I mean, Europe has sort of held its peace. So, I mean, it's a great polemical point you made. So I take it in that spirit.
I think as a follow-up to that, a lot of the noises I've been hearing, both in the United States and here in Europe, is on a similar train, that you have a problem with China on the border. It's been going on for decades now. It is getting worse. What position does that leave you in when it comes to seeking support if further incursions are done, further skirmishes happen at the border or within the border, to kind of echo what's happening in Ukraine in terms of sovereignty issues that are being raised?
Sorry, do you mind if I interrupt you here?
No, please do. But I want to come back to a question, the crux of the question, which I asked a few people in the political circles, in the financial circles. What's your big question? And one of the foremost geopolitical strategists on Wall Street sent me this question for you. Mm-hmm. And the question is simple. If and when the choice comes down to it, not today, not tomorrow, but in the future, and she strongly believes it will, for India, will it become, in terms of support, the US or China? And that will be kind of a defining moment that comes out of the situation that we face with Russia right now.
Look, number one, you know, why I wanted to interrupt you in a way. I mean, I'm partly reacting to the previous observation. You know, somewhere Europe has to grow out of the mindset that Europe's problems are the world's problems. But the world's problems are not Europe's problems. That it's, if it is you, it's yours. If it is me, it's ours. I think that's something, and I see, you know, reflections of that. Again, in terms of, you know, there is a linkage today which is being made. You know, a linkage between China and India and what's happening in Ukraine. So come on, guys. I mean, China and India happened way before anything happened in Ukraine. So the Chinese don't need a precedent somewhere else in the world on how to, you know, engage us or not engage us, or be difficult with us or not be difficult with us. So as I said, I mean, I just see this as frankly a not very clever argument, a very self-serving one. This idea that, you know, your grand strategy must be about how you will choose. I will do what, as all of us do. I will weigh the situation, you know, like everybody, after all, how do countries eventually make decisions?
There will always be two axes at this point. I think it's an understood, accepted fact that you have the West, US-led, You have China as the next potential axis. Where does India fit into this? But are you planning to not pick a
No,
side?
I'm sorry. That is exactly where I disagree with you. This is the construct you are trying to impose on me, and I don't accept it. I mean, I don't think it's necessary for me to join this axis or not, and if I'm not joining this, I must be with the other one. I don't accept that. I mean, I think I'm 1/5 of the world's population. I am, today, the 5th or 6th largest economy in the world. I mean, forget the history, civilization bit, everybody knows that. But I think I'm entitled to have my own side. I'm entitled to weigh my own interests, make my own choices. And my choices will not be cynical and transactional, but they will be a balance of my values and my interests. There is no country in the world which disregards its interests.
So, as a final question, because I know you have to go, and our time has been cut short
And
a little
the
bit by
coffee
your
break
staff.
is coming,
The
yes.
coffee break is less important, but your staff is insisting you have meetings. As a final question, then, to leave us with this perspective, as you say, there's a whole part of the world that we are ignoring and the perspectives that we're ignoring. What will or what is India's position on the world stage? Because if you want to talk about 1/5 of the world's population, you cannot also sit on the fence when it comes to foreign policy matters. Non-alignment isn't plausible if you want to take your position on the world stage. What does it look like with 3 years of your government left, approximately? And what does
Of this term.
Of
2 years, actually.
Oh,
but-
2 years.
Yes.
Thank you for the correction. Or even in the next decade or so. What is India's position? Sitting on the fence is not an option to be a world leader.
Look, I don't think we're sitting on the fence. Just because I don't agree with you doesn't make me sitting on the fence. It means I'm sitting on my ground. And my ground is actually, what are the big challenges of the world? Okay? Big challenges of the world are climate change. I think I'm very critical to the solution. I can be an exemplar. I can be actually an arena for an enormous leapfrogging of green technologies. Look at terrorism. Look at the emergence of a world order. Look at security. Look at sustainable development goals. I mean, you take any and all of the big challenges of the world, some part of the answer either comes out of India, can be contributed to India. And again, I hate to say, it's a bit like a broken record, but look, a lot of things are happening outside Europe. We have, partly because of climate change, for a lot of humanitarian, natural disasters, humanitarian responses. In our part of the world today, a lot of people look to us to help out. The days when they expected Europe to come, which Europe did at the 2004 tsunami. The difference today is nobody's even thinking of that anymore. So the world is changing, new players are coming, new capabilities are coming, but a new agenda must come. The world cannot be that Eurocentric as it used to be in the past.
And who will India play with? Will it be Europe and the US, or will it be China and Russia?
Look, they're not exclusionary, but we are a democracy. We are a market economy. We are a pluralistic society. We have laws and contracts. We have positions on international law. So I think that should give you a fair part of the answer. After all, you began the question with a reference to the Quad. I mean, even though we didn't get much time to talk about it, but the fact that you have today a grouping like the Quad, we just had its summit in Tokyo, where very important decisions were made on connectivity, on telecommunications, on supply chains, on cybersecurity, on maritime domain awareness. It should tell you something which direction we're going. So again, I urge you that don't use necessarily a caricature version of one situation as a yardstick to pass a sweeping judgment. Because even on Ukraine, do reflect on this point. Somewhere at some point, surely the conflict has to end. Somebody will have to, a set of people, it cannot be a single country, probably not, will have to engage the players. It is our collective interest to find some kind of resolution. unless you're throwing up your hands and say this is not fixable. So at that point, I think people will need us.
Says a diplomat, a career diplomat turned politician, then diplomacy, and keep going with it. Thank you very much, Minister, for joining us, and thank you all for being part of this conversation.
I now give the floor to His Excellency Subramaniam Jaishankar, Minister for External Affairs, of India.
Madam President, Excellencies, distinguished members of the General Assembly, I bring to you the greetings of 1.3 billion plus people from the world's largest democracy. They join me in congratulating the President of the General Assembly, Ambassador Csaba Kőrösi, on his election to chair the 77th session of the UN General Assembly. They follow closely developments at the United Nations, reflecting the increasingly globalized nature of our existence. We meet at a challenging time for the world order. This session's theme, a watershed moment, transformative solutions to interlocking challenges, seeks to capture its seriousness. Excellencies, the year 2022 is an important milestone in India's journey towards growth, development, and prosperity. India is celebrating 75 years of its independence, what we call Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav. The story of that period has been one of toil, of determination, innovation, and enterprise of millions of ordinary Indians. They are rejuvenating a society pillaged by centuries of foreign attacks and colonialism. And they are doing so in a democratic framework whose steady progress is reflected in more authentic voices and grounded leadership. This new India, under the visionary and dynamic leadership of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, is a confident and resurgent society. Its agenda for our centenary will be achieved through the 5 pledges that we committed to on our Independence Day. 1, we are resolved to make India a developed country in the next 25 years. For the world, that creates more capacities for global good. 2, we will liberate ourselves from a colonial mindset. Externally, this means reformed multilateralism and more contemporary global governance. 3, our rich civilizational heritage will be a source of pride and of strength. This includes care and concern for the environment, so ingrained in our traditional ethos. 4, we will promote greater unity and solidarity. This expresses a coming together on global issues such as terrorism, pandemics, or the environment. And 5, we will instill consciousness of duties and responsibilities. This applies to nations as much as it does to citizens. These 5 pledges affirm our age-old outlook that sees the world as one family. We believe that national good and global good can be entirely in harmony. It is this conviction that led us to supply vaccines to over 100 nations. Similarly, our evacuation operations in HADR situations always had room for other nationals in distress. Even as we meet our own development targets, India offers partnerships to our brothers and sisters in Asia, in Africa, and Latin America. And we do so based on their needs and their priorities. Today, the focus is on green growth, better connectivity, digital delivery, and accessible health. Our solidarity is not just in words. You can see them in 700 projects across the world. Madam President, even while India contributes to global betterment, we recognize the sharp deterioration in the international landscape. The world is already struggling with challenges of post-pandemic economic recovery. The debt situation of the developing is precarious. To this is now added the rising costs and the shrinking availability of fuel, of food, and of fertilizers. These, along with trade disruptions and diversions, are among the many consequences of the Ukraine conflict. The Indo-Pacific, too, witnesses fresh concerns about its stability and its security. And climate events have added an overlay on these mounting anxieties. As we saw in the case of the COVID pandemic, the South will be the most impacted, even if the immediate causes are well beyond. It is imperative that global conversations recognize this deep unfairness. The inequity of vaccine distribution should not be replicated in other domains. Madam President, as the Ukraine conflict continues to rage, we are often asked, whose side are we on? And our answer each time is straight and honest. India is on the side of peace and will remain firmly there. We are on the side that respects the UN Charter and its founding principles. We are on the side that calls for dialogue and diplomacy as the only way out. We are on the side of those struggling to make ends meet, even as they stare at the escalating costs of food, of fuel, and fertilizers. It is therefore in our collective interest to work constructively, both within the United Nations and outside, in finding an early resolution to this conflict. Excellencies, while the global attention has been on Ukraine, India has also had to contend with other challenges, especially in its own neighborhood. Some of them may be aggravated by the COVID pandemic and ongoing conflicts, but they speak too of a deeper malaise. The accumulation of debt in fragile economies is of particular concern. We believe that in such times, the international community must rise above narrow national agendas. India, for its part, is taking exceptional measures in exceptional times. We do so when we send 50,000 metric tons of wheat and multiple tranches of medicines and vaccines to Afghanistan. When we extend credits of $3.8 billion to Sri Lanka for fuel, essential commodities, and trade settlement. When we supply 10,000 metric tons of food aid and vaccine shipments to Myanmar. When we fill the gap in humanitarian needs left unaddressed by political complexity. Whether it is disaster response or humanitarian assistance, India has stood strong, contributing particularly to those nearest to us. Excellencies, the world as we knew it is poised for transformational changes. It has been impacted in recent times by a succession of shocks, each of them significant by itself. The COVID pandemic called into question the over-centralized nature of globalization and has led all of us to seek greater resilience and reliability of supply chains. The repercussions of the ongoing Ukraine conflict have further heightened economic stresses, especially on food and energy. Climate events have added to disruption that the world is already facing. As for the promise of technology, it has certainly multiplied our capabilities, but also added to our vulnerabilities. Trust and transparency are legitimate expectations of a more digitized world. The quest to create a better global order would necessarily have to address all these issues. Among them, some are clearly more existential in nature and necessitate intense coordination by the international community. Climate action and climate justice are particularly noteworthy in this respect. In their pursuit, India has worked with partners on the International Solar Alliance, the One Sun, One World, One Grid initiative, and the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. We stand ready to support any collective and equitable endeavor to protect our environment and to further global wellness. Lifestyle for Environment, or LIFE, as declared by Prime Minister Narendra Modi in Glasgow on the sidelines of COP26, is our homage to Mother Nature. India remains deeply committed to fighting climate change under the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. We do so on the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities in the light of different national circumstances. We have announced our updated nationally determined contributions after COP26. Excellencies, India's steadfast commitment to South-South cooperation is by now well established and well recognized. Our approach is based on principles of mutual respect and national ownership, with a commitment to sustainable development for all. As we begin the G20 presidency this December, we are sensitive to the challenges faced by developing countries. India will work with other G20 members to address serious issues of debt, of economic growth, food and energy security, and particularly of environment. The reform of governance of multilateral financial institutions will continue to be one of our core priorities. Madam President, India would be completing its tenure as a member of the Security Council this year. In our term, we have acted as a bridge on some serious but divisive issues confronting the Council. We have also focused on concerns such as maritime security, peacekeeping, and counterterrorism. Our contributions range from providing technology with a human touch to ensuring safety and security of UN peacekeepers. As the chair of the Counterterrorism Committee this year, India would be hosting its special meeting in Mumbai and New Delhi. I invite all member states to participate in it. We need to create a global architecture that responds to the new tech tools deployed against open, diverse, and pluralistic societies. Having borne the brunt of cross-border terrorism for decades, India firmly advocates a zero-tolerance approach. In our view, there is no justification for any act of terrorism regardless of motivation, and no rhetoric, however sanctimonious, can ever cover up bloodstains. The United Nations responds to terrorism by sanctioning its perpetrators. Those who politicize the UNSC 1267 sanctions regime, sometimes even to the extent of defending proclaimed terrorists, they do so at their own peril. Believe me, they advance neither their own interests nor indeed their reputation. India has always espoused a cooperative, inclusive, and consultative approach to international relations. We believe that multipolarity, rebalancing, fair globalization, and reformed multilateralism cannot be kept in abeyance. The call for reformed multilateralism, with reforms of the Security Council at its core, enjoys considerable support among UN members. It does so because of the widespread recognition that the current architecture is anachronistic and ineffective. It is also perceived as deeply unfair, denying entire continents and regions a voice in a forum that deliberates their future. India is prepared to take up greater responsibilities, but it seeks, at the same time, to ensure that the injustice faced by the Global South is decisively addressed. Our call is to allow serious negotiations on such a critical matter to proceed sincerely. They must not be blocked by procedural tactics. Naysayers cannot hold the IGN process hostage in perpetuity. In these turbulent times, it is essential that the world listens to more voices of reason and experiences more acts of goodwill. India is willing and able on both counts. We believe and advocate that this is not an era of war or of conflict. On the contrary, it is a time for development and for cooperation. Madam President, in the past, this august assembly has served as a meeting point of views and as a catalyst for action. It is vital that we continue to believe in the promise of diplomacy and the need for international cooperation. Therefore, Madam President, let us strive to return to the course of seeking peace, progress, and prosperity. I thank you.
I thank the Minister for External Affairs of India. I now give the floor to
country in terms of the ground level reality. Smriti ji was talking about how we created, this PPE industry out of nowhere. I want you to think maybe 3, 4, 5 years back, we have actually created a social safety system in this country out of nowhere. If I had told you in 2014 that 8 years later of this government, we would be sitting here going through a COVID, having ensured 800 million people got food, 400 million people got money on their bank accounts, that, again, hundreds of million people today think in terms of health access, who get financial support to start businesses. That if you look, and just look at some of these numbers, I mean, they're just staggering, not just the food and the bank account numbers. I mean, if you look even at how many houses got electrified. So there is an enormous actually change happening in front of our eyes. That class which you spoke about, I think is not entirely cognizant of it, because most of us, I mean, and I'm not, it's not a condescending remark. I mean, I would ask myself, how much time did I in my life actually get out of cities and travel around in India? And I think one of the things which politicians do is actually they have a much better feel for the state of the country, because they actually go out there and see what it is for real. So one part of it is the country is changing, the society is changing. I think we are really gearing up to a completely new phase. But in this period, we are, just think next even 5 years, 8 years ahead. I'm not even talking 25 years. We will be the most populous country, #1 in the world. In fact, if partition had not happened, we would have always been #1 in the world. We would be among 3rd or 4th largest economy even by nominal terms. We are a nuclear weapon power. Our capabilities, look at it in maritime, look at it in economic terms, technology terms, are growing by the day. Our businesses are growing. Our media is growing. You know, we have, I mean, if you look at today the big debates, even in foreign policy, it does matter to the world. One of the issues, I've just had 9 ASEAN foreign ministers or their representatives visit me. Where India stands does matter to them. They take the cues from that. So we need to ask ourselves, what am I? What is my weight? What is my worth? Where am I going? You know, what will be my place in the world? And the simplest answer I can say is we must develop, nurture and polish that sense of independence, that sense of self-confidence, and which will mean moments like you showed out there, but we have to stand up for ourselves, we have to stand up for our interests, we must have clarity. And I think one of the, you know, honestly the attributes, or I would say the personality traits of this Prime Minister, which is why, you know, when you kind of got the call, you would not hesitate, is you look at someone and say, okay, that's the kind of person who will, you know, take us on that trajectory.
So the reason I asked about where does Indian foreign policy, or how would you define Indian foreign policy as it stands today, through much of the 50s and 60s, you know, it was defined as non-alignment. And then we had this period called strategic autonomy, and then there was multipolarity. Now I think many people in this audience and people who are watching you across the world, what they want to know is, where are we? Are we in the US camp? Are we in the Russian camp? Are we in our own camp?
You know, we are not perhaps at a stage where we can say we have our own camp. But as I said, a lot of countries take their cues. You know, I see this every day. For example, in the UN, we are a member of the Security Council. There are almost daily issues which come up before us. Many of these issues go into the General Assembly. So a lot of countries do ask you, so saying, what are you going to do? What's your vote like? What are you going to say? But I would say our influence is growing, but I would say it's still, we are quite far from where you can say we would have our camp in the way in which, say, the US has a camp. Maybe the world will be very different and there will be no need to have a camp, I don't know. But where, you know, other powers are concerned, and many of them in terms of capability and influence are more powerful than us, we must accept that. we will have on many issues, there will be countries with whom we would agree, we would have common interests on many issues. There will be some where it will be deeper, there will be some it will be less, there will be some where we will have virtually no similarity of interest, there will be very sharp contradiction. So you will get a spectrum. But the reason why I said it's very important for us to be independent and self-confident is if we want to get the best out of the world for India, we must have that ability to look at a situation, look at it very clinically, assess our interests, pick our course of action. Now, it will not be constant. There will be issues, where I may agree with country X or a group Y more than I would others. So, it will in some senses appear inconsistent, but inconsistency in that is a subset of independence there. And I think we should not allow that mind game to be played that somewhere you are an outlier, you are not in sync with the world, etc. That's very hegemonic. That's like saying if you're not with us,
you're against us.
No, you are sort of out of the mainstream. I don't think people are necessarily saying today on some issues, the pressure is not for us or against us. The pressure is, you really should be with us because you're missing out on something, it's not, it's not right, or there are very nuanced ways of developing that argument.
So one of those issues which we have confronted recently is the war in Ukraine, and clearly India has taken a slightly nuanced position compared to even, let's say, some of the other members of the Quad. Is there better understanding of India's nuanced position on this war today than there was, let's say, 3 months ago when the war began?
Yes, I think there is. In part because we have also made a big effort at putting our viewpoint across. And it is a different position because, let's be clear, India's history with Russia is different from, since you use Quad, from America's history or Japan's history or Australia's history. So it cannot be, if we have different histories and to a great measure different interests on this matter, that we will have identical positions. But we have always been clear that everybody, all members of the Quad don't have identical positions on everything. I mean, if it was indeed identical positions, I could ask the other three, why are your positions on Pakistan not exactly the same as mine? So it can't be that, on Pakistan everybody has a lowest, has a degree of convergence, but on one other issue we must all agree totally. So, the governments get it. Look, you've seen even in recent days, you had somebody very serious in the United States saying, look, we take a long view of our relationship with India. Now, I will tell you, I take a very long view of my relationship with the United States and the relationship with Japan and Australia as well. So, I know that there will be issues on which, could be trade issues, could be developmental issues, climate change issues. I may not wholly agree, but we are today in a much more flexible, pragmatic, sort of, I would say, kind of get on with it world where you look for people with whom at a very basic level your interests match, you have a common agenda. Sometimes that agenda can be, like say in the Quad, very Indo-Pacific centered. It doesn't automatically extrapolate into something else, and then you work with it.
So one of the things that you had said recently, and I said this earlier as well, you've become a bit of a viral sensation, and I want you to elaborate a little more in substantive terms, because I think it encompasses what the world is going through, how the world is viewing India, and more importantly, how India is viewing the world. When you said at the Bratislava Forum recently that Europe must get out of this mindset that Europe's problems are the world's problems, but the world's problems are not Europe's problems. And you gave the example of what happened in Afghanistan just last year. At that time, nobody was shouting from the rooftop saying, why is Europe not taking a position? So do you feel, I wouldn't call it double standards, but there seems to be a mismatch that some of the problems that are happening far away, Indo-Pacific, they don't take a stance, but they expect India to take a stance that is happening on their continent.
No, you're being a bit harsh here.
I'm being harsh.
Yes. No, I'll tell you why. It's not so much double standards, because at the end of the day, whether people or countries admit it, everybody looks at the world from their perspective. So there's a inherent selfishness in the way we look at the world. What is important is to develop that ability, if you want to carry other people with you, to also have some sense of their perspective and their interest. That's how you build coalitions, if you would. Take the Quad, for example. You know, why is it today? I mean, look at the United States. I mean, everybody would maybe I'm among the older people in the room, but our history with the United States is a very troubled history. That a lot of our problems with Pakistan are directly attributable to the support which the United States gave Pakistan.
True.
And the United States, especially in the 1990s, you know, what they called the unipolar moment, was obviously very, very dominant. But today you have a United States which is able to actually, that long view which was spoken about, which is actually able to say, you know, here is India. India has a different history. They have a relationship with Russia. We have to take that into account. So you have to cut the other, you know, give the other party that much slack of that understanding. And part of the reason why Quad has worked is that the other, the four of us have given each other that degree of latitude and understanding. My sense where Europe is concerned is, in many ways, because of NATO, because of the circumstances of the European Union, they were not directly involved in hard security challenges. Okay, so I don't want to call it a bubble, but let us say they've had a more comfortable recent past than many other geographies. When they are confronted with such a situation, their level of emotion and their level of, I would say, agitation at this point of time, it almost makes them sort of feel, you know, there can be one point of view and that's our point of view, and therefore that inclination to think, okay, here's somebody else who has a different history and different interests, and therefore should I approach him in a different way, perhaps that is not so well developed. I think this experience in a way would actually connect them much more to other parts of the world. So I think you will see a very different sense of European diplomacy which will come out of it. I do remember for a lot of other challenges in other parts of the world, Europe actually took the more sanguine view, took the more, you know, minimalistic view. I mean, even if you were to look at Afghanistan, I mean, a large part of the concerns was about migration.
Yeah.
My sense is there will be a evolution as a result of this set of issues, and we engage Europe very, very intensively. I think if you look at Prime Minister Modi, very few Indian Prime Ministers have spent as much time directly engaging European leaders. So we need to work at it. I think they need to work at it, and maybe we will get to have a better understanding of each other's interests.
All right, let's talk about one set of other countries that, again, the Prime Minister has invested very heavily in, and that is the Gulf countries. And I want to talk a little bit about this controversy that happened recently with one of the former spokespersons of your party and some of the comments that she made. There was a blowback. So I want to know, first of all, were you surprised at the level of blowback from some of the countries that we saw? And what may you say to address some of those concerns?
No, look, you know, what was said was not the position of the party. I think the party made it very, very clear in very strong terms. The party took action, and the countries, not just in the Gulf, I would say even in Southeast Asia, some countries who had concerns do appreciate, you know, that this was not the position of the government. Look, they deal with us. They know what we are about, I mean, we are their image of India. I mean, when you have a minister or somebody who are a head of government, I mean, it's their counterparts who when they think of India, that's what they, so they know that these are not our views. But since, what was said, what was very regrettably said was said, I think once the party clarified its position, our expectation is that people will understand that. Now, there will be people who will fish in troubled waters. I mean, that's natural, and international relations is a very competitive game which is not played by Queensberry rules. So there will be people who will try and get the most of it. I think we need to engage, we need to put across our point of view. I think we are doing it. I would suggest to you that even in the last few days, you can see that people do understand what is the true picture in India.
One of the concerns thereof from that controversy was, and some people were asking about this as well, is, why should India, democracy, 1 billion plus people, we've had elections regularly every 5 years, why should we be told or why should we be lectured by countries whose record on any issue, whether it's democracy, human rights, etc., is far worse than India's or not a patch on India's? How may you want to address that?
I don't see it that way. I don't see it that way, and I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, I'm also a little sensitive to being lectured, as you saw, but I would not take this issue as a lecture. Okay. I think this was an issue where the sensibilities and the sensitivities of people were impacted. So they were articulating that. So I don't agree with the way this has been put to you. So my view is again that we have to be very clear about what we stand for. And once and the party has done that, so my sense is we should really sort of handle it this way.
Okay. Let me come to another issue which has been sort of hanging fire for the last couple of years, and you were previously ambassador to China as well. You've dealt with China very, very closely. What is your best understanding of the situation at the line of actual control in Eastern Ladakh as it stands today? And what can you say to our viewers who are watching this as to why the talks, and we've had, 15 rounds of talks, why have the talks not yielded the expected results?
No, well, it depends on what you call the expected results. And I also want to tell you, it's not like the talks have come to an end.
Sure.
And by the way, it's not like this has been the longest talks we've had. If you look at Sumdorongchu, those talks went on forever.
Correct.
But here's the common sense explanation of what happened. Look, for whatever reason, China, in violation of the 1993 and 96 agreements not to mass troops on the LAC, chose to do so. Okay. Their attempt was obviously to unilaterally change the LAC. Now, we are not prepared to put up with it. So even though we were in the midst of COVID at that time, through an enormous logistical effort, which I think sometimes has not been adequately recognized by people, by analysts, even in our politics in this country, by an enormous logistical effort, we were actually able to counter them at the LAC. Now, again, some people have a simplistic idea as though there's a line and therefore you're on either side of the line. The reality is the troops are in depth areas and they do patrolling. That's why you have all these terms which you've become familiar with, PP, patrolling point something. You don't typically deploy at the patrolling point. It's a patrolling point. You go there and see it. Now, what has happened as a result of this is, because they had forward deployments, which were new deployments, and we counter-deployed, we also had forward deployments. Now, you ended up with a very sort of intricate mix of like this, and which was very dangerous, because they were too proximate, the rules of engagement were not being observed. And then exactly what we apprehended happened at Galwan 2 years ago, which was, it became violent and there were casualties. Now, since then, we've had a situation where we negotiate the friction points, and when you said, have you yielded results, many of those friction points have been resolved. Okay, there are areas where they pull back, we pull back. So, because remember, both of us are very much in advance of what were our pre-April positions. Has it all been done? No. Has we made substantial solutions? Actually, yes. I mean, the most intractable and to my mind the most dangerous case of close-up deployments, because you actually crisscross deployed, was in Pangong Tso and around Pangong Tso. So it is hard work, it is very patient work, but we are very, very clear on one point, which is we will not allow any unilateral attempt by China to change the status quo or to alter the LAC. So I don't care how long it takes, how many rounds we do, how hard we have to negotiate, but this is something we are very, very clear on.
So let me go from one neighbor, the northern neighbor, to our western neighbor. Obviously, recently you've seen some conciliatory statements coming in from their Prime Minister, and I believe yesterday your counterpart, the Foreign Minister of Pakistan, made some conciliatory remarks. And I'm just curious to know what you think of the status of the ceasefire as it stands today. Is it working? Is it not working? And will there be an attempt to reach or let's say to meet Pakistan halfway if they are extending a conciliatory hand or a hand of friendship, if you will?
Look, this is not just a matter of words. I mean, if it's a matter of words, I mean, you probably very rarely heard me say anything harsh unless provoked. Finally, what is the test? I mean, where did things go wrong? Let's go back to it. This Prime Minister has made such an enormous effort actually to reach out to Pakistan beginning with day one of his tenure. Okay. Now, I mean, if you look, and sometimes in heated rhetoric, lots of things are said. I really, in our history, cannot think of any figure on either side who has striven more to find some kind of modus vivendi. And it's happened because I think people in our country trust him with that. I mean, the people feel that, Mr. Modi, where national security is concerned, will never compromise on it. And that actually strengthens him in many ways. But where it went wrong was actually cross-border terrorism. Cross-border terrorism at Uri, cross-border terrorism at Pathankot, at Uri, at Pulwama. So finally, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. I mean, you have to see what is actually happening on the ground. And to say nice things and good intent, and please don't think I'm in any way decrying it, minimizing it. I'm not. If there are people who would like to reach out and improve relations, I think it's a good thing. But I would only say that eventually nice words have to be matched by concrete actions on the ground. Then the nice words actually become more credible. So these are early days. So let us see where it goes.
Have you seen any commensurate action on the ground in terms of reduction of cross-border terror or the concerns that India has?
I don't know if today I could make such a definitive judgment.
Okay. Let's talk about the neighbor north of that, Afghanistan. We have an engagement going with Afghanistan. We had a team from the MEA there a few days ago. Today again, unfortunately, there was an attack on a Gurdwara there. So first, I want your thoughts on that. And two, what is our position? Are we going to formally have a mission there? Do you have a timeline? What is our position when it comes to engaging with the new government there?
Look, here's our problem. We have, you know, it's a cliche, but we really have a historical relationship with Afghans. And I assume you've been there a few times to Afghanistan?
No, I've not.
No. Okay. You know, I've been there obviously before August 15th last year. And I can genuinely tell you, there are very few places I've been to in the world where popular sentiment, I mean, if you went to Kabul or Herat or something, where actually popular sentiment is so positive on India. And you know, they had a range of leaders and so on who would quarrel with each other, but on one issue everybody was united, which was India. Now, over these years, we have done a huge range of development projects. We've really contributed to all the good things that happened in this period. You know, other countries also did a lot of good, but often because they had both military and developmental responsibilities, often the goodwill of one was negated by the other. In our case, it is actually unmixed goodwill. So if you talk to people, you know, we are the country who brought a pediatric hospital to Kabul, who brought electricity to Kabul, who created clinics, who built their road which goes around. So if you look pretty much at any any part of civil society, teachers, doctors, artists, military people, police people, administrators, tax people, everybody has been to India, dealt with India, benefited from India. So there's an enormous constituency out there. Now, at this moment, because of what happened last year, they're having a food problem. They're having a medicine problem. They're having a COVID problem. And they are going to increasingly slide into really maintaining civil society problem. Now, here's our dilemma. Do we then just throw up our hands and say, well, things went in the wrong direction and therefore we are no longer going to do anything? Or do you actually say, okay, I will take sort of the bigger picture, there's a humanitarian issue out there, and let me see from a kind of a long-term perspective, I find ways of helping Afghan society. So we are trying to work our way through that dilemma. And the reason why we sent a team was really to understand, as you know, we've been sending food. We are one of the biggest suppliers of medicines. Our team actually went to the hospital there, the Indira Gandhi Hospital, which is one of the main hospitals there. We've been the main provider of vaccines. So we looked at it, and I think we are grappling with this view that, you know, how do we actually find a way of helping Afghan society through what is obviously very complicated and very difficult time. So beyond that, at this time, I really don't have any answers that I can share with you.
But no timelines on if we want to establish a mission there, if we want to have some form of engagement there?
Well, look, if I were to do something about it, you will see it on breaking news.
I was hoping I could get some from you tonight.
No, look, you know, it's not something which you are going to debate in public. I mean, if we reach that point, we will do it, because we will do it only for this reason, that at the end of the day, was stable border management. There were no military casualties on the border from 1975. That changed because we had agreements with China not to bring military forces to we call it border, but it's line of actual control. And the Chinese violated those agreements. Now, the state of the border will determine the state of the relationship. That's natural. So obviously, relations with China right now, going through a very difficult phase. But I would quite honestly again question your question, that therefore our relations with the West are better. My relations with the West were quite decent before June 2020. So again, I would challenge that, correlation that you're making.
But of course, we've seen India step up in the Quad. We've seen India seek to strengthen relations, bilateral relations with Australia even further. You made your first visit to Australia as External Affairs Minister. I think it was just last week when Minister Payne hosted you. So I think we have seen, in fact, a strengthening of India's relations, perhaps with some countries in the Quad at the very least, even if it might not mean enduring strengthening of ties with the West.
Well, you know, this incarnation of the Quad started in 2017. Mm-hmm. I participated in the first meeting when I was Foreign Secretary, like the Permanent Under-Secretary. So it's not a post-2020 development. Yeah. Our relations with the Quad partners, the United States, Japan, Australia, have steadily improved in the last 20 years. Right. Again, as I said, you're making it seem like cause and effect.
Right.
I would challenge that.
Okay.
I think the Quad has a value in itself. It's 4 countries who recognize today that the world would be a better place if they cooperated. And that's essentially what's happening.
Thank you. Perhaps just one more question on India and Southeast Asia. Prime Minister Modi has look East, enact East policy. He's sought to focus more in Southeast Asia. However, a recent poll, in fact, I think it was published just last week, indicates that on this occasion of the 30th anniversary of ASEAN-India relations, which we celebrate this year, at this time, levels of trust between Southeast Asian countries and India are fairly low. India ranks 5th after Japan, the United States, the EU, China, and only 16.6% of respondents in this poll have said that they have confidence in India. What do you think India can do better to leverage its great soft power in the region?
I'm a politician, so I believe in polls, but I've never seen a poll which has made any sense to me when it comes to foreign policy. Mm-hmm. So I guess the one you cited probably is part of a long list there. But I would say that our relations right now with the ASEAN are actually growing well. If I were to actually look at the evolution, there are 2 big changes which are taking place. We have much stronger security cooperation with the ASEAN. I've just come from a trip to the Philippines, where we've actually signed agreements for military supplies to the Philippines. We are part of ADMM+. We have strong bilateral relations with Singapore, Indonesia, and Vietnam, amongst others. And the other is physical connectivity. So I hate to challenge you for the 4th time, but I don't think that poll's very good.
Challenge away, please. Minister Payne, let me come to you, and hopefully it'll be less contentious. Australia has sought to strengthen both unilateral as well as bilateral security relations in response to what your minister has described at the launch of your 2020 Defence Strategic Update as a post-COVID world that is poorer, more dangerous, and more disorderly. I think the security environment has deteriorated ever since Australia's 2017 Foreign Policy White Paper. What are some of the key changes that you've seen since Australia's 2017 White Paper?
I can probably also respond to your question since Australia's 2016 Defence White Paper, which is a good catch. There's a cricket team in the world that could do with that. Since Australia's 2016 Defence White Paper, which I was also responsible for producing. But I think we're clearly in an era of growing and pervasive strategic competition. And it is important for those of us who want to prosecute the case for the rules-based global order, for the rule of law, for human rights, for the values that underpin our liberal democracies, to engage actively in that strategic competition. And Australia does that across a very broad canvas. We do that, and I reflect on my friend Jay's response to your last question. We do that with the enhancement and the development of our key bilateral relationships. Australia and India signed a comprehensive strategic partnership in 2020, right at the beginning of some of the greatest challenges of the COVID pandemic. I think it was Prime Minister Modi's first virtual undertaking in COVID, and happily we're here in person because we're all zoomed out. Australia and Japan have just signed a reciprocal access agreement which will transform and enhance the way we're able to engage, particularly between the Japanese Self-Defence Force and the Australian Defence Force. Australia and the United States have just marked the 70th anniversary of the signing of the ANZUS Treaty, which reinforces the now well-known phrase that we enjoy as a foundation of the alliance, 100 years of mateship. That's a bilateral scan. But in terms of minilaterals, you've referred and spoken with Dr. Jaishankar about the Quad. And when I think about how the Quad has transformed from the first in-person foreign ministers meeting, which Dr. Jaishankar and I were both participants in New York on the sidelines of UNGA in September of 2019, to an in-person Quad Leaders Summit in 2021, notwithstanding the extraordinary exigencies of COVID-19 and what has wrought upon the world. When I think about an in-person Quad Leaders Summit and being able to come to that point together as liberal democracies, and then when I think about the fact that the four of us, all four Foreign Minister and Foreign Minister equivalents, were able to meet in Australia in Melbourne just 10 days ago. That says to me that the value of less traditional groupings at a time of great strategic competition is immensely important. It also says to me that where we do have traditional groupings, whether it's through the G7 and the plus aspect of the G7, in which India and Australia have both participated during the chair of the United Kingdom and France, the G7, the G20, which this year is led by Indonesia, the world's most populous Muslim nation in the Indo-Pacific. It's a very powerful message to see the G20 being led by India, and what we're able to do through that. And then for Australia, our engagement with ASEAN, which for us is at the centre of the Indo-Pacific, and the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific and its principles are very much in accord with our own view of an Indo-Pacific that is secure, that is stable, that is prosperous, that is free from coercion, and that encourages the growth of the sorts of relationships that I've talked about. And as well as ASEAN, for us, the Pacific Island Forum. This is an important part of our strategic and family engagement, as Australia so often refers to the Pacific, where priorities are different. Where priorities right now are health security and the extraordinary impact of COVID-19 on countries of small populations which are economically challenged by lockdowns and closures of countries through COVID. So health security, economic security, climate change, and the work that we do with them is absolutely focused on climate adaptation and climate resilience. So there's some of the things that we have pursued in the last few years, both since the 2016 Defence White Paper and the 2017 Foreign Policy White Paper, which reflect the very significant changes we're seeing in the region.
Thank you. And of course, Australia has also entered into the AUKUS deal with the United States and the UK. The deal has largely been welcome, including by many countries in the region. But critics of the deal have also argued that it will lead to an arms race and that it will lead to China and Russia seeking to double down on their naval partnership without significantly contributing to Australia or the region's security in the next 20 years, which is the length of time it takes. It's estimated that the submarines will take to be built. What would your response to these critics be?
Respectfully, I would say that any suggestion that Australia's acquisition of nuclear-powered submarines and our engagement with our great and traditional allies and partners, the United States and the United Kingdom, on issues like quantum computing, artificial intelligence and cyber. Any suggestion that that's going to contribute to an arms race, given Australia's record in non-proliferation, our absolute focus and commitment on ensuring that we continue to maintain that first-class record, is fanciful or potentially ridiculous. And I would also say that as a country which focuses very strongly on addressing disinformation and misinformation wherever we see it, that we would call out those sorts of statements as misinformation and disinformation. We would shine light on those and we would expose people and countries who are making those sorts of statements. I understand, though, that given the consequence of such an important decision, that the work that we are doing with our friends and partners in ASEAN, within the Pacific, particularly on the issues of non-proliferation, is essential. And that's why I'm pleased to line up Australia's record on non-proliferation, Australia's engagement with the IAEA against anyone who would seek to suggest that we're contributing to an arms race.
You mentioned climate change earlier, and of course also your greater engagement, intensified engagement with the Pacific. So Australia has the Pacific Step-Up Program, and these countries in the Pacific have actually identified climate change as the single greatest threat to the Pacific. How good a job do you think your government has done in helping Pacific Island countries mitigate the threat of climate change? And in this respect, I'd like to highlight for you to address how Australia reportedly blocked Pacific Island leaders from agreeing on a joint declaration to tackle climate change and phase out coal, and how Australia last year received the lowest score awarded to any of the 193 members of the United Nations for the level of climate action. And this is according to a Sustainable Development report that produced the UN-backed Sustainable Development Solutions Network.
So our engagement with the Pacific is constant and has been particularly enhanced in the context of response to COVID-19. That includes our support for health security and vaccine delivery in particular, but also COVID economic recovery, whether that is in budget support or in other ways. But they are all contributions which we've made across the Pacific in particularly the past 2 years. But our focus is very much as a member of the Pacific Island Forum, an equal member of the Pacific Island Forum with the 17 other nations and who make up the forum itself. And whether it is in working on infrastructure with our partners through the Australia Infrastructure Financing Facility for the Pacific, all of the work that we do through the AIFFP is ensuring that infrastructure development doesn't add, for example, to unaffordable debt loads for partners in the Pacific, that it is focused on their priorities, not the priority of another country that may assert that this is what a country in the Pacific wants, that it is focused on being climate adapted and climate resilient in water, in energy, in transport and in telecommunications. And so that's seen in the last few years the development of submarine cables, for example, which Australia has delivered between Honiara in the Solomon Islands and the Australian mainland, and similarly between Port Moresby and the Australian mainland, the Coral Sea cable. The Trilateral Infrastructure Partnership, which my friends in the United States and Japan and I support strongly across the region, has most recently delivered the Palau Spur cable and has now most recently agreed on the East Micronesia submarine cable, which will enhance the connectivity of countries like Kiribati, of Nauru and of the Republic of the Federated States of Micronesia. Transformative infrastructure that enhances the operation of health systems and education systems. And then the work that we've done within our own country, particularly on emissions reduction, which has, for example, between 2005 and 2020, seen emissions reduced in Australia by almost 21%, which is double the OECD average. On that part, and also the fact that we know that the projections in relation to our Paris commitments will see us exceed our 26 to 28% commitment to emissions reduction by reaching 35% by 2030 is an important part of Australia's record as well. And we do think there's a difference between targets and achievements. In Australia's case, they're achievements, and we're delivering.
Thank you very much, Minister Payne. Mr. Hayashi, could I now move to you? For those of you who do not know, I just learnt that from Minister Payne that Minister Hayashi sings very well. So perhaps after the session, we might get him to sing a note or two. But before that, Minister, could I please ask you about how, so in Southeast Asia, we often hear about how US-China rivalry is putting many of the countries there in a bind, and I understand that in Japan as well, US-China rivalry is also putting Japan in a bit of a pickle, given that it relies on the United States for security, but is greatly connected to the Chinese economy as well. But I'd like to hear how China's actions in the region, particularly in the East China Sea, for instance, but also its actions further afield from that, are catalyzing Japan's security policy, and what changes we might expect to see in Japan's security policy.
Thank you. And about our foreign policy leading vis-à-vis China, since our bilateral relationship is really important, not only for the two countries, but also for the peace and prosperity of all the areas and in the Pacific. So we are trying to build a constructive and a stable relationship with China by maintaining and messaging our position. So when we should say the things to China, we really says to them. Don't hesitate to send a message vocally, and also strongly requesting China responsible activities as a stakeholder in these areas. So and at the same time cooperating on matters of the common interest. For example, for environment issues, such as Mali is talking about, those issues we can cooperate with them. But security issues, other issues, we have to really speak out that if you should obey the rules, we can go together. But if you don't, maybe we should stand here, so that you have to think about that. So those are the really different balance between those two, But so, for example, together with the environment issues, vis-a-vis North Korea, the US and Japan, and need a cooperation with China, because we started to have a six-party talk, and including Japan, US, China, and Russia. But now, we have great concern in the Ukraine issues, so six-party talk now is not possible. But still, the vis-a-vis North Korea, we have to cooperate with the China to some extent. But for those issues such as Taiwan, and those issues such as the high-tech technologies like AI, quantum, and biotechnologies and other things, we should compete. So we are in the same boat, like with US and like-minded countries, on the basis of democracy and values such as human rights, and those things has to be on the base of doing any kind of interaction with China. So we, as United, we have a kind of war here. So, and war has to be very strong, and they have to circumvent the walls in a sense that they shouldn't break these big walls united here, which is built by the common universal values such as the democracies. So I think, and also we are now under the severe situation in Ukraine, but Ukraine issues is not only the European issues, but it has a great meaning to the other areas in the Pacific too. So, yeah, that's my thought here.
You mentioned the need to speak out on security issues, and you also mentioned Taiwan. Recently, we have seen a series of high-level pronouncements from Japan about Taiwan. So your defense minister linked Taiwan's security with that of Japan's. Your defense, this was in June 2021, your deputy defense minister was reported as saying that Japan has to protect Taiwan as a democratic country. That was in July 2021 as well. And in December, I think the former Japanese Prime Minister Abe said that Japan and the United States could not stand by if China attacked Taiwan.